Hello and welcome to Nightly Bruin, where we uncover the mysterious side of UCLA. My name is Jina Bae and I'm a podcast contributor at the Daily Bruin.
And this is Audrey Turner, and I am a podcast contributor as well. Today, we are tapping into the paranormal, the study that tries to explain the unexplainable.
So first, what is parapsychology?
So, psychology today defines it as a field of study that investigates paranormal or psychic phenomena, including purported mental abilities, such as telepathy or telekinesis. Parapsychologists aim to test the existence and explore the nature of experiences and abilities in the paranormal realm.
And what do they study?
So they study extrasensory perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, psychometry, and a lot more.
And where was this studied?
It was actually studied right here at UCLA for 10 years, 1968 to 78.
Wow, how did people react to this?
So according to Barry E. Taff, who is a former researcher at the UCLA Parapsychology Lab, reality TV entertainment polluted its legitimacy. This caused people to doubt it, labeling it as pseudoscience. As a matter of fact, Carol Burnett came by the Parapsychology Lab to try creating photos with her mind. The people making The Exorcist visited while researching for the movie. William Friedkin, the director, actually consulted with the researchers.
Speaking of the entertainment industry, who was Thelma Moss?
Yeah, so she was a Broadway actress turned screenwriter. Her interest in starting the lab was catalyzed by a former encounter with Alec Guinness, the star of one of her movies, and then James Dean, someone who the two met at a restaurant. Dean showed the two a sports car, and Guinness warned him that if he got in that car, he would be dead in the next week. Dean brushed it off, but ended up being killed in an accident the very next Friday.
Did Moss continue pursuing this path as a screenwriter?
No, she did not. Unfortunately, her husband died just after their daughter was born in 1954, which drove her to depression and suicide attempts. She attempted some other psychiatric treatments, but finding them lacking, she turned to LSD-assisted therapy. After her positive experiences with it, she wrote a book called Myself and I, eventually pursuing a psychology doctorate degree.
Where did her experiences take her next?
Well, she decided to start teaching at UCLA, specifically in the field of medical psychology. However, one of her most notable aspects of her teaching career was founding a lab that studies paranormal phenomena.
What were some of the most significant areas of research?
Her controversial research on Kirkland photography is what she's best known for. She was excited for the prospect of creating images that embody religious halos and the legendary aura that could aid treatment for rare diseases like cancer.
Is this technique still used today?
It's not used for treatments Moss envisioned, but rather for more of an art form today.
Is there anyone notable that she trained?
So Barry E. Taff, Carrie Gaynor, and Judith Orloff are three established parapsychologists who she trained, who completed tasks ranging from examining haunted locations to actually becoming an associate professor of clinical psychiatry at UCLA.
Barry E. Taff was a researcher with his own psychic abilities. The lab published a paper specifically on Barry E. Taff in a medical journal.
Is this paper available to the public?
No. According to Taff, publishers rejected publication of the research paper as the data collected from him was unique. Thus, editors assumed that the equipment was broken.
Well, how did the lab collect data if not on a researcher himself like Barry E. Taff? How did this lab operate on a daily basis?
Researchers Barry E. Taff and Carrie Gaynor would go to investigate houses. They had a methodological approach as they had an extensive interview with subjects who reported cases of paranormal activity first.
And what were these questions for?
The questions were to weed out cases that had normal explanations. Turns out, in the 4,800 cases, most of them had normal explanations.
Okay, well, how about the cases that didn't have normal explanations?
There was one famous case in Culver City where reports mentioned seeing objects moving on their own and weird lights appearing out of the blue. The first time researchers entered the house, they said a frying pan flew out of the cupboard at them. Researchers took the cabinet apart in attempts to figure out what was happening, but failed to make meaningful conclusions. Ultimately, the Culver City case was turned into a movie called The Entity with Barbara Hershey.
And what happened to the lab? Did anyone visit?
People did. One such case involved Albert Selmy, a Hollywood actor known for Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Dragon Slayer, Caddyshack, and Gunsmoke. In the 1970s, Selmy's wife Roberta visited the UCLA parapsychology lab. Several research subjects reported unsettling premonitions, visions of a tragic fate for Roberta. They predicted a dark and violent event involving Roberta and her husband, raising concerns that something tragic might unfold in the future. She ignored the warning.
Wow, so what happened next?
Then, years later, in April 1990, Albert Selmy killed Roberta in a murder-suicide in the couple's home. Taff himself later recounted this event, emphasizing how research subjects at the lab had predicted the tragedy years before it happened.
Wow. So what were the objectives of these studies?
According to Dr. Barry Taff and Carrie Gaynor, in an interview following the release of the movie The Entity, they stated their effort is to reveal an objective reality to supernatural events that had been treated as subjective experiences for the past hundreds of years.
So were there other institutions apart from UCLA Lab that conducted research in the field of parapsychology?
Yes. Some other notable institutions included the Duke University's Parapsychology Laboratory of the 1930s to 1960s, Stanford Research Institute, which ran between 1970s to 80s, and the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab running between 1979 to 2007. Notably, the Stanford Research Institute was a CIA-sponsored research to develop military applications of remote viewing, the alleged ability to perceive distant or unseen locations, objects, or people through extrasensory perception. The idea was to train individuals to visualize and describe hidden targets such as enemy military installations without being physically present.
And I know there are a lot of students who would love a research position in a parapsychology lab. So does the UCLA lab still exist today?
No, the lab gained so much popularity that it drew the attention of influential people in the field like Carlos Castaneda and Uri Geller. But this popularity led to UCLA shutting down in the lab and firing Moss in 1978.
So how long did Thelma continue her work for?
She continued working in private, but due to a cerebral aneurysm in the 1980s, she had to stop working.
And she had a prominent influence. According to her, she was able to improve the telepathic abilities of her subjects with techniques like sensory deprivation, emotionally charged material, and drug induction, which are employed by many parapsychologists today.
Our producer contacted Barry E. Taff, who is willing to speak with us for the episode of Nightly Bruin.
The Daily Bruin sat down with Barry Taff and Judith Orloff to explore the unexplainable and their experiences being involved in the world of parapsychology, which the Bruin couldn't independently verify.
Dr. Taff, welcome to the Nightly Bruin. So can you start by telling us a little about yourself? And
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So how'd you get involved in parapsychology?
Okay, it's real simple. Growing up, I was having chronic paranormal experiences, telepathic, precognitive, out of body, all that. And it was normal for me, but it wasn't normal for my friends and family. They began to think, what the hell's wrong with Barry? So it kept happening. And the older I got, the more frequent they became. So I learned that a woman named Dr. Thelma Moss had a laboratory at UCLA dealing with parapsychology. Not a department, a laboratory. Located in what's called the old Neuropsychiatric Institute, part of the medical center. And now it's called the Semmel Institute, because Terry Semmel gave money to. We were on the 5th floor. Weird thing, the bottoms, there were 2 on lower floor, then it went up. We were on the 5th floor, the small lab. It's like a front floor, right? And Dr. Moss got a bad reputation. And what really was the demise of her career, she got involved purely in photography, which is a waste of time. You're not photographing aura, it's corona discharge. It can be manipulated by the presence or lack of moisture. So she got away from the actual paranormal work, is doing the curling work. So she was hired as a clinical psychologist to have patients and evaluate them and write assessments. But she was doing more of the curling photography. And how all this began, Dr. West, he was the head of the NPI. We met, we didn't really know each other. And had she I didn't know this till a few years ago. He was the one who sent the intelligence people to my research group, not Dr. Moss. So he was interested. He knew what we were doing, but he couldn't acknowledge that or he can be fired. I should say that another thing that got me involved with this field was that I'm a medical intuitive. I can look through people like I'm looking at glass. I can diagnose the problems people have, what they're going to have, regularity. And it's caused me a lot of problems. Friends and people feel very awkward or stressed around me, worried that I'm going to pick up something on them. It's that simple, and I can't explain it.
Do you have like an exact reason why it shut down?
Well, here's the whole thing. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Universities, whether they're government, like it's a University of California or it's a private school like USC or Stanford or whatever, they exist out in endowments. People endow money to that university so they can keep functioning.
Yeah.
They can teachers, they do research, the medical, whatever. Yeah. That's it. If the university is linked to something that most people think is wacky or crazy, the people who give endowment will stop.
Yeah.
Disappear. It's that simple. It's like paranoid as hell. And I understand it. If I wasn't there, I'd say, no. But that's what it comes down to.
This kind of work is not accepted in mainstream science. And I think in previous phone calls, you were saying how it's sometimes labeled as anti-science. How do we bridge the gap between making this seen more?
We just a lot of study my ability in telepathy and precognition or clairvoyance, whatever you call it. And I would be in the lab in a special chamber, like an isolation chamber, shielding from the environment. I'd be in there, and then she'd be doing something else on campus or further away with other people. My job was to tell her describe what I see. This went on for weeks and months and months and nothing. And those critical things happened. They took measurements of my body, and one of which was an electroencephalograph. So they had me wired up. It's some big deal. And it's the electrodes on your head and everything. And so in normal waking consciousness, like I am now, speaking, I was generating about 10 hertz at about 1,000 microvolts, which would kill a person. And she didn't get it. And I could hear the needles on the diagram, boom, 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 because the amplitude was so high. And they didn't get it. Okay, so study was done, and he submitted it to medical journals, one of which took and published in 1974, 75. Forgot the name of the journal. But the one thing they would not publish was the neurophysiological data they collected through an EEG. They said, no, they said, anyone that had that kind of amperage in their brain would die, go into seizure, and you have a major. So, and you bite your tongue off. Nope. And we went to 3 different labs at the medical center and had the same measurements done. See, most people degenerate in EEG stuff. So I was being spoken to by Dr. Moss, and they said, we're sorry, but this can't be real. No one has brainwaves like that. It's a big deal. So I became a research assistant in the lab. And by that point, I was almost in graduate. I'd finished. I got my bachelor's degree. Then I entered a doctoral program at UCLA in psychophysiology of biomedical engineering. That's the cheap way to study medicine. And I'm too inquisitive because I was asking questions so much in my classes. In graduate school, professors got really angry about me and said, if you keep asking questions, we're going to throw you out of the class. They don't like being questioned on something they don't know the answer to. Anyway, so got my doctorates in 1975. And the lab was up and running. I did 2 things. One was I studied what was later called remote viewing. The ability from, like, say, for you are, to see what's in the room I'm in, even though you're not here, or before video cameras. And, you'd see things at a distance. So my theory was, if you was tempted to use standard learning paradigm, could you train them to be psychic, people who've never had the experience? Well, the worst going to happen is nothing. The best is something. So I started running the work a couple of times a week, and I had a sensory deprivation where it's complete darkness. You couldn't hear or see anything. only your own mind. Rather than writing it down, I said to people, verbally describe what you're saying. This went on and on. And over time, you're getting lots of people were coming in. There were some standard people, men and women, but all these people kept showing up. I didn't really know who they were. And one of them gave us a name of something that sounded really bizarre. And I remember I was describing a new submarine with something called a Trident D2 missile. This is before those submarines built and they were developed. People showed up and we described environments that we couldn't have known about. And some of the things I said, I remember, was so state specific, as well as other people said this, that they demanded we surrender the audio tape because there was classified information on there. Okay. So then the government was really interested. They came to that in my group more and more frequently. And we didn't really know these people at all. And until the first work was done, I didn't even know who they were. I thought they were just regular people coming in. They were adults, so certainly older than me, at least by a decade, and mostly men, but some women. We had visitors from the Department of Defense, from DARPA, the CIA, the NSA, all these different intelligence. And they kept trying to test us, and it worked very well. Okay, so we knew it worked, and we could control it to a small degree. It worked well enough where we were shocked by the continuity of it and by the method we were using. That learning paradigm, if you're doing a specific task and you're informed as to when you're working properly versus when you're not working properly, you'll begin to understand what you have to do to make it occur again. Standard learning paradigm. When you're in any form of academia, that's normal. So we're doing this and doing it went really well. But then we got bored. Real time, the most compelling part of this work is beyond that. We went out on, well, now it's been thousands of cases investigating poltergeists and hauntings. And I have to say, 99% of these cases, you go out, interview the people, they answer a lot of your questions, you measure the environment. We didn't have video cameras back then. You take pictures, you measure the environment, different energy, look for patterns in the data. And most of the time you go out, interview the people, and you leave. That's it. It's sort of like winning the lottery at $1 billion level. It's very improbable to do. It probably did. Okay. But once in a while, something happens that really shakes everyone up. This happened on my old colleague, Kerry Gaynor, was in Hunter's books in Westwood way back when. He's talking to a friend about our work. So a woman and her friend are on the next aisle, and they hear Kerry talking about the work we're doing. She says, "Excuse me, sir, but my house is haunted." Okay, rather than talk to her there, gave us her number. We called her, went out to her house in Culver City on August 22nd, 1974. It's a rundown little shack. Looked terrible. We entered the house. It smelled like something died there, like a decomposing organic odor. It was terrible. Middle of urine, it was horrible. Doors by there, wasn't it? And the whole point of it is, when she told us that, my first thought was that she needs psychiatric intervention, not parapsychologist intervention. So we went to the tour of the house. It was horrible. Hot as hell, very humid. No air conditioning. So talk with her. And what's happening? Here's keep in touch, And we thought this night, what we can do? It's just her. We go about a week later. She calls. More things have been happening. Okay, go back. It wasn't far from West LA, which is where both Kerry and I lived. And we go there. Again, really hot, really humid. We're in the kitchen, and suddenly the lower cupboard door flies open, and the iron skillet goes flying across the kitchen. And we made sure there were no animals there, or children buried there, or springs or wires, and there weren't any. And skeptics, but how far did it go? Who cares? We're trying to collect data. There's something paranormal happening here. Okay, so the case evolved to a teenage boy that when they played certain music, the phenomena would happen. What? So we played the music by Black Sabbath. Great music to bore your tears with, or drive anything living or dead crazy. With the cupboard flying open, and we're in her bedroom, and we took pictures. One of them showed it looked like a comet, the ball of light with a tail on it. That's what we saw. Yeah, we were shooting at 6400 ASA, what you called a Tri-X film, which was at the time the most sensitive, was black and white. Then this kept going, it kept increasing. Things are moving around the apartment. Long story short, we investigated the case for 10 weeks, which is a long time for us. And so we're in her bedroom, and weird lights started showing up. And to make sure they weren't coming from outside the house, we sealed up all the windows with black poster boards. We put them on the ceilings and walls. And because we couldn't tell how fast the ball of light was moving or where it came from or went to, each number had a magnetic orientation. And up would be top of this west, north, east, whatever it is. So we're and music's playing and Doris going kind of crazy. And these beautiful corpuscular masses, if you remember when you're young to know what a lava lamp was, it looked like these large things of green jello zipping around the room. And it was amazing. We saw it. They would come and go and come and go. We got, at one point, she was, one of the case involved, she was sitting on her bed in the bedroom, took lots of pictures. We saw light zipping around. So we took 2 pictures, our professional photographer, and it showed these 2 of our most famous pictures of that case. You see Doris kind of going like this, lights are zipping around her, and they formed a perfect arc, a luminous arc. And then if you look closely in the upper left of the frame, you see a secondary arc going top to top. The phenomenon kept going and going. But we did learn that before she moved to Culver City with her 4 children, she was living in Santa Monica, and things were happening to her there, but at a much lower degree, less frequently. Something about this was an extension of Doris. I don't believe personally that there was a consciousness entity or that was raping her. That's what people think. But my bet would be that if I met her today, the first thing I would do is I would run up to test her if she was epileptic or seizure prone. The most common course of my work, which is now 56 years in time, it is odd that almost every poltergeist agent I've met turns out to either be seizure prone or epileptic. However, most people who are epileptic are not poltergeist agents. There's something in the middle that's missing. And we'll only bet that Doris might have been seizure prone. That's my guess. You go out in cases and interview people, and finally they say, oh, by the way, it's irrelevant, I'm epileptic. Or seizure. Yep, this is the whole story. It's convoluted. My book, Aliens Below, speaks to this. I call it inductive resonance coupling, which is a physics term, that if the person is hypersensitive to these forces, their body is more permeable to it. The environment will affect her and then help her to emit what she wouldn't otherwise. Doris, okay, now so she finally got up enough money from Culver City. It was my observation, from Culver City to Carson. Now she was wise, and we never brought her in front of the media. She would have been a triple witness. Wouldn't have worked. So by that time we met. I already knew Frank DiFilippo, who was a filmmaker, director, and writer. And we invited him to meet Doris, and he met her. And while she was very cryptic with Terry and I, she wouldn't even tell us her age. What? Tell us her age? Anything about her life, very evasive. Nowadays, if people won't give us that information, I just get up and I leave. It's not worth our time. So she moves. And guess what? The phenomenon moved with her.
Now, we turn to our conversation with Dr. Judith Orloff, a UCLA psychiatrist, author, and former member of the Parapsychology Lab who explores the connection between intuition, energy, and emotional well-being.
I saw that you joined the UCLA Parapsychology Lab when you were 19 years old, so I was curious about what drew you in and what your first encounter with the work was like.
Yes, that lab was run by my mentor, Dr. Thelma Moss, who was a premier parapsychologist. And she studied, in today's terminology, she studied consciousness. In those days, it was called parapsychology more. She was, what brought me there was that I was an empathic child. I was an empath, and I had very strong intuitions that came true. that were very hard for me to integrate into my life. And my parents, who were both doctors, and I have 25 doctors in my family, said never mention another one of your intuitions again at home. So I, went through a period where I got involved with drugs as a teenager, and I was eventually sent to the psychiatrist, Dr. Jim Grold, who was able to say to me, in order to be whole, you have to incorporate your intuition into who you are. And I'd like you to go see this parapsychologist, Dr. Thelma Moss at UCLA. So my psychiatrist at a very young age sent me over there, which was fantastic. It was the best thing that ever could have happened to me. And she welcomed me into her lab. She gave me to test me till she gave me her keys. I went to her little office downstairs and she tested me, and I held her keys, and she says, just tell me what comes to you. It could be anything. And so I shared some impressions that I had, and she said, they're very accurate. I think you need to come and volunteer in our lab, and you're going to learn so much and feel so much better about yourself as a result. And so I began, at that age to work in the most wondrous place that is imaginable for me, because I, I'd always felt not a part of. I always felt different. I always felt nobody understood me. And this was the first place where they truly did understand me. I mean, more than that, scientists were basing their careers on this topic. So it was just a teeny tiny little lab. It was like a hole in the wall. And so it didn't have much space in the UCLA system. But Jolly West befriended Thelma Moss and was her champion. So she stayed there for many years.
I'm very curious to hear a bit more about what Thelma Moss was like as a mentor, like maybe apart from those kind of that initial integration throughout your work in the lab, how she encouraged you to embrace your abilities and helped you feel involved in the work that was happening, and just kind of more about your experience with her in general.
Well, she always wore a white coat with her name on it. She was a very strong woman, very authoritative woman. She didn't put up with much. She just was devoted to the work. And she was very curious. Despite her traditional psychological background, she wasn't an MD, she was a psychologist. She invited all kinds of healers to the lab. She was very curious and open. And we had Uri Geller come to the lab, who was a psychic years ago. I'm hesitant to use the word psychic because it turns people off, but an intuitive years ago who used to bend metal with his mind. And so she brought him to the lab, and we witnessed this. And in fact, my own keys got bent. My house keys got bent during the experiment. So I'll always remember that. And she was... what she did, she assigned me a project. It was a year-long project of something called Carillion photography. And what that is that it's a special photographic technique that measures supposedly the energy field around plants. And so I picked 5 of my favorite plants, the leaves, and I would take pictures of them each month to see how they changed with the seasons. At the end, we saw, what happened, in terms of the plants. And then we also did some fun things where if someone came into the lab, we'd ask them to put their hand next to the plants. And sometimes the plant liked the person, and the other times, you saw the energy going completely the other way, and then some people had embraced. So a lot of people don't think that there's anything to Carillion photography, but I really think there is. And I think plants have been proven, years later to, have an amazing form of communication with each other and the world and us with plants. So it was before all the scientific information came in. And so I was working in that capacity and witnessing different healers as they did laying on of hands, and different kinds of intuitive readings. You can understand what an important turning point that was for me when I had never been understood before. And here was just all these people suddenly out of the blue. And so I'm very grateful to my psychiatrist at that time. And in fact, he inspired me to go into psychiatry, which I've been in for 30 years. It all worked out.
I think although there are these researchers that were very supportive of this field, I'm curious how you and the others in the lab handled skepticism that you faced, both internally and from the broader scientific community. I'm curious how that kind of expanded, as you began working with the lab, and how you learned maybe from your mentors, techniques to handle that, and just how you all approach that kind of skepticism in general.
Well, it's part of the landscape. What I learned from the lab and what I practice is total acceptance of skepticism. People are entitled to believe as they will. And if it goes against their basic belief system, they don't want to develop their intuition. They don't want to see reality bigger than what they're used to. That's fine. I don't have any negative feelings about it. But what I do know, and certainly since I've written books and I wrote my first book, Second Sight, which was all about me integrating intuition with traditional medicine and my childhood and how I came to grips with my intuition, how I brought it together in terms of who I am. Anyways, I built my whole professional life on the basis that we're more than just one thing. We can be intellectual, we can be intuitive, we can be heart-centered, we can be logical. We don't have to just be one thing. And so there's so many people who are attracted to that. Let me tell you that for the ones who are skeptical, God bless them. I hope they're happy and go about your path. I'm just thrilled everybody's here on this beautiful earth, trying to make sense out of it.
Kind of building off of what you just said about integrating the intuitive, the intellectual, all these different fields, what was it that kind of prompted you to pursue traditional medicine after your time at the lab? And did you ever feel sort of tension between your scientific training and your intuitive experiences, or did you feel like that was kind of a natural path for you?
I kind of swung like a pendulum. I spent those years with Thelma Moss, a few years with Thelma Moss, and then I had a dream while I was working in her lab in which a voice came to me in the dream and said, you need to become a psychiatrist in order to have the credentials to legitimize intuition in medicine, basically. And in the dream, I thought, oh my God, that's okay. I thought that's great. But then I woke up and it was the last thing I wanted to do. Believe me, I didn't. My parents, I was brought up around doctors all the time. My parents had such active practices and they were so in love with their work, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to become an artist or a writer. And my friends were always on the fringe and the edge. So I had no interest, really, when I woke up at doing it. But because of Thelma and because I was starting to trust my intuition, I enrolled in Santa Monica College just to see how it would go. I had dropped out of school, by the way, at that point when I was with Thelma. And one course became two, all the years of medical training because it was my destiny. And so I just gave it a little chance. I enrolled in one class just to see how it would go. And I remember it was a geography class because there was nothing left. It was perfect because it talked about the physical dynamics of the wind and the moon and the stars and the earth and how we're all connected. And it was just perfect for me. So that's how I got started. And then when I went to medical school, I had a very hard time with the first year because it was science. I was more artistic and this was all scientific, and I had a hard time learning to think that way. But I had, very wonderful people along the path who helped me think that way. You helped me study. You helped me to open up my mind to that. And then I graduated USC, and then I did my psychiatric residency at UCLA, where I still supervise residents on a weekly basis, teaching them to integrate intuition and empathy into their patient care. I supervise them with their patients. And so that's kind of the long arc of the story. But I want to say that when I went through my medical training, I strayed very far from the intuitive realm again. I got deeply immersed in science. And the only people I saw who had any kind of intuition were psychotic people who came in to the emergency room who were psychotic and claiming to see God or claiming to predict the future. And so psychic was equated with psychotic, which was not good from my perspective. And so I kind of strayed away. That was the only paradigm psychiatry had at that point for trying to explain the whole thing. And so I went very far. But then when I graduated my residency, I went far for about or maybe 8 years, through my medical training. And then after I graduated, my intuitive side began to open up again. And then from then on, it stayed open.
I was wondering if maybe you could explain for us what the difference is clinically between intuition and something like psychosis, and how you distinguish those lines within your psychiatric work.
Yes, well, intuition is listening to the still small voice inside that tells you the truth about things, either through compassion or through neutrality. That's how the most accurate intuitions are. Psychosis is when you hear voices talking to you, telling you to hurt yourself or hurt somebody else or do something negative or destructive. And intuition never tells you to do that.
I see. So intuition is more about kind of listening to like your inner thoughts, and that are guiding you in the right direction, versus something that you kind of verbally hear that may be pushing you to do something not ideal, that's kind of harmful to you and other people. That makes sense. That's a really great distinction. And I was also wondering what advice you would give to someone who is curious about their intuition but is afraid of judgment or being wrong, or just kind of, associated fears with trusting that part of themselves a little bit more.
Right. Well, you will be wrong. That's part of the process. When you learn to trust your intuition, it's a learning curve. So, I suggest people get my first book, Second Sight, or my second book, Guide to Intuitive Healing, to have a plan in terms of how to develop your intuition, like listening to your gut feeling. That's very important. Or listening to a hunch you might have, or listening to a dream that you might get with somebody, or listening to your body so that if you feel, let's say, drained around somebody, that's your intuition telling you something's off. So I would suggest be very self-compassionate. It's a process. The more you practice, the better you get. And to share it with like-minded people. What in the beginning, what you don't want to be around are all these people, naysayers, saying, oh, you can't do it. This is not good. And there are plenty of them. Let me tell you, there are plenty of them. But to be around positive people who just, want to support you and listening to your inner voice.
I actually had one quick question about the lab that I forgot to ask earlier that I wanted to touch back on. So in my research, I found that at the time you were working there, the lab was not officially sanctioned by UCLA. And so I was wondering how that affected maybe the work being done and how seriously it was taken at the time, like that aspect specifically, the fact that it wasn't sanctioned.
But to be honest with you, when I was that age and I walked in there, I don't think I knew anything about that. That was not, they didn't share that with me. It wasn't a big worry that I heard about all the time. And so I didn't know and I didn't care. I found my tribe. I just was so happy that somebody understood me.
You mentioned your first book, Second Sight. I would love to hear a little bit more about maybe what inspired you to write that, to talk about your journey and compile your advice in that way.
So Second Sight was my first book. It took me 8 years to write. And it was because I had so much fear about what people would think of me when it came out. I had a lot of fear that my medical colleagues would mock me or would somehow hurt me in the medical profession. My mother, who was a physician, really fed into that belief system. She said, be careful. You don't want to offend anyone. You don't want people to think you're weird. All that voice. And so that took some working through for me, to be able to feel comfortable. But my desire to share with people my process, and that as a psychiatrist, as a therapist, as a massage therapist, as anybody in the helping professions, it is vital to incorporate intuition into how you work with people. And I knew that at the time. And because of my dream that I had years ago, I knew that that was part of what I was supposed to be doing here. And so I wanted to write it in such a way through a personal journey so people can know what I went through and my pain and my shame of having these abilities and how I was able to get through it to get to a point of really being helpful to the large numbers of people. And so this book was the vehicle to do that. And I found that when the book came out and I saw all the positive response to it and people saying, I needed to hear this. I needed to learn this. I want to learn how to incorporate intuition into working with patients. I knew that everything would be all right because I saw the good it could be done from it. So I recommend everyone who's starting to read Second Sight and then my second book, Guide to Intuitive Healing, which are 5 steps to developing intuition that could get you started.
And I was also wondering if you were to design a modern day research lab like the one that you were part of, the one that helped you feel more connected to yourself and added this scientific validity to things that were affecting you on a day-to-day basis. I was wondering what, the design of that lab might look like, maybe crucial elements that you would involve in it, or just kind of what ideas come to mind when thinking about incorporating that into the modern day.
Yeah, well, I think the Institute of Noetic Sciences up in Northern California epitomizes that lab because they do all kinds of studying of, it's called non-local consciousness. That's the term, the intuition for the scientific term for it, non-local consciousness. And so, they do. Dr. Jean Radin, who's this incredible researcher, devoted for many, many years, has done many studies on double-blind studies on intuition and what's accurate and what isn't accurate. And so you would need to have a team of research scientists who understand double-blind protocols to do this kind of research. And so you need to have qualified people who could organize the study and get grants, in order to prove. Well, they don't need to prove to themselves, but to prove to others in the scientific community how to, what the use of intuition and how it can be documented in a double-blind study and put in journals that traditional scientists would respect. So that's very important to get the team together. And there's always some version of a sensory deprivation chamber where you can do the work, so you're not intruded upon by excess noise or light or people are walking in, and to have a very quiet environment. And then also, I would say to have groups. Thelma did this too. We had intuition groups where we invited the community to come once a week to talk about how to develop intuition and to have that. And, maybe now, online, because we didn't have any internet online to be able to have groups or to create communities and to help people learn and grow. And a special program for healthcare practitioners. As I have a Becoming an Intuitive Healer program that I would love to put into this lab and, help people in the scientific community and those who are treating patients, those in patient care, how to incorporate this into their work and also how to take care of themselves so they don't get drained and exhausted from their work. Very important. So there's a few, and I thought about it. Those are a few points. Good question.
You've talked a lot about kind of the practice of incorporating what you teach into actual patient care. And so I'm curious, maybe what are a couple of the pieces of advice that you give to maybe your residents or healthcare practitioners?
Okay, well, there's 2 possibilities. The practitioner could use his or her intuition to help enhance their abilities to understand patients, or the patients can learn from the practitioners how to do that and how to trust themselves. And so first thing, always trust your gut feeling. What's the difference between the mind and the thought and a gut feeling? The mind is linear. The mind will give you A plus B equals C, gives you columns of positives and negatives, but that's not what the intuition does. Intuition gives you flashes of truth or how will guidance and how to move forward. So to learn the difference between that, to be able to take breaks between patients rather than back to back. And I know that's hard because I supervise 2 women who are psychiatric residents now, and they're so busy. UCLA keeps them so busy. So it's hard sometimes to get that, even that breath, but it's important to at least take a breath between patients so you can be centered and not frazzled. And then also I'm a big believer in meditation. That's my primary spiritual practice. And where you're able to calm down and breathe and center yourself and come from your heart and connect to yourself every day and say nice things to yourself during meditation, not horrible things like beating yourself up. So learning how to treat yourself in a very positive, respectful way, learning how to tune into your body, your intuition, your gut feeling when you're with patients, and to weigh the intuitive information and learn how to use it. Like sometimes, like one thing that I teach is when do you share an intuition with a patient, that kind of thing. And I tune into whether it would be helpful or not to share it and how to share it. So everybody has to learn not to do that. What I might say if I got guidance to go forward with saying anything is to say, I think it might be helpful to go to your internist to get a workup for stress. I wouldn't scare people. So there's a finesse and a technique and how you talk to people with intuition that are common mistakes people make. So, I would help the patient or whoever you're talking to, or, to get through it and to say what's good to say, what isn't to say. If they make a mistake, that's fine. Learn from the mistake. So as you can see, it's a beautiful process, but you have to have someone in charge and who has some experience, So, I'm very happy, over the years to have been able to train other healthcare practitioners with these basic skills so they could go out and do that for other people.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Orloff.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Nightly Bruin from Daily Bruin Podcasts. You can listen to other Nightly Bruin episodes and other Daily Bruin podcasts on Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts.